Alright, picture this. Your best friend, the one guy you've trusted your whole life, suddenly turns into a total stranger. All because of one girl. And before I know it, I'm neck-deep in a twisted game of betrayal, secrets, and, yeah, even some seriously dangerous people. I'm talking about shady deals, late-night threats, a friend who's now my biggest enemy, and a girl caught in the middle of it all. This isn't just some love triangle drama. This is life or death. Stick around, because I'm about to tell you the craziest story of how I lost everything and somehow found a way out. My name is Michael, and for as long as I can remember, my best friend was Adam. We grew up on the same street in Brooklyn, going to the same schools, sharing the same ambitions, and even playing on the same baseball team every summer. We spent hours practicing our pitching and batting skills, dreaming of one day playing professionally or making a name for ourselves in some way. I saw him as my brother, my family, someone I could count on in every way. I never once thought that anything or anyone could come between us, until Sarah came into our lives. Sarah moved into the neighborhood during our sophomore year of high school, and she quickly became part of our friend group. We spent almost every day together, just hanging out at the diner on 7th, where they served the best burgers in town, or going down to the local baseball field where Adam and I practiced. Sarah fit right in, and I think that was part of why we both fell for her. She was funny, smart, and had this effortless charm that just drew people to her. It did not take long before I noticed that Adam was acting differently around her. I could see it in the way he watched her, the way he seemed to hang on every word she said. It was subtle at first, but as time went on, his feelings for her became more obvious. The thing is, I felt the same way. I tried to ignore it, thinking that maybe my friendship with Adam was more important than whatever feelings I had for Sarah. I thought I could just push those feelings down, pretend they didn't exist, and keep things the way they were. But the more I tried to bury those feelings, the harder it became to be around her. There was something about Sarah that made me feel alive in a way I'd never felt before. She had this contagious energy, a laugh that could light up a room, and a kindness that was rare to find. Every time she looked at me, I felt this spark, this connection that I couldn't ignore. And eventually, I realized that I was in love with her. I kept it to myself for a long time, partly out of loyalty to Adam, and partly because I didn't want to risk ruining the friendship we all shared. I told myself it was just a crush, that it would fade with time. But deep down, I knew that wasn't true. My feelings for Sarah only grew stronger, and every day it became harder to pretend otherwise. Then one night, Adam finally confronted me. We were sitting at Joe's Diner, our usual hangout spot, grabbing a late-night burger after a long day. The place was quiet, with only a few other customers scattered around, and the dim lights made everything feel more intense, like we were in some kind of movie. Adam was unusually quiet that night, barely touching his food. I could tell something was on his mind, but I didn't want to push him. After a long silence, he looked at me, his expression serious. "Michael," he said, his voice low and steady. "We need to talk about Sarah." The way he said her name sent a chill down my spine. I looked at him, trying to keep my expression neutral, but I could feel my heart pounding in my chest. "What about her?" I asked, even though I already knew what he was going to say. He sighed, running a hand through his hair, looking almost pained. "I'm in love with her, man. I think I've loved her since the day I met her. And I can't just sit back and pretend like I don't. I want to be with her, and I don't want anything or anyone to stand in my way." I felt a mix of emotions hit me all at once. Shock, anger, sadness. But mostly I felt hurt. Adam was my best friend, the one person I thought I could count on, and now he was asking me to just step aside, to give up on someone who meant as much to me as she did to him. "I love her too," I said quietly, my voice barely more than a whisper. "I can't just walk away from her, Adam. Not even for you." For a moment, there was only silence between us. I could see the hurt in his eyes, but I could also see something darker. A determination, a resolve that I had never seen before. It was like he was ready to fight for her, no matter what it cost. "Fine," he said eventually, his tone cold and unyielding. "But don't say I didn't warn you." With that, he stood up, threw a few bills on the table, and walked out, leaving me sitting there alone. I watched him go, feeling a sinking feeling in my stomach. I knew that our friendship had just changed in a way that couldn't be undone. After that night, things between us were never the same. We stopped hanging out as much, and when we did see each other, there was always this tension in the air, this unspoken rivalry. It was like we were both waiting for the other to make a move, to do something that would break the fragile peace between us. It was painful, knowing that someone I once trusted with my life now saw me as a threat, as competition. But I told myself that it would be okay, that we would work it out eventually. Couldn't have been more wrong. Late one night, as I was walking home from the gym, I felt someone watching me. At first, I thought I was just being paranoid, that it was nothing more than my mind playing tricks on me. But as I kept walking, the feeling grew stronger, more intense. I glanced over my shoulder and saw a group of guys following me, their faces hidden in the shadows. I quickened my pace, hoping to lose them, but they matched my speed, closing in on me. Before I knew it, they were on me, hitting and kicking me from all sides. I tried to fight back, but there were too many of them. One of them pulled out a knife, slashing at me, and the pain was so intense that everything around me started to blur. I remember falling to the ground, the world spinning around me, and then everything went black. When I woke up, I was in the hospital, hooked up to machines, my side heavily bandaged. The nurse told me that I was lucky to be alive, that if someone hadn't found me when they did, I might not have made it. But all I could think about was why this had happened. Who would want to hurt me like that? And then the detective came in. "Mr. Thompson," he said, his tone calm but serious. "Do you have any enemies? Anyone who might want to see you hurt?" I thought about Adam, about the cold look in his eyes that night at the diner, about the way he'd warned me. I didn't want to believe it, but the pieces were starting to fit together. I don't know," I stammered, feeling a surge of anger and betrayal. Could Adam really have done this? Could he have gone so far? The thought made me feel sick, but deep down, I couldn't shake the feeling that it might be true. After 2 weeks in the hospital, I was discharged, though the doctors warned me it would be months before I was fully recovered. The physical pain was bearable, but the mental toll weighed heavier on me each day. I could not stop thinking about that night, about the attack, and the gnawing feeling that Adam might have been behind it. Even though there was no proof, I couldn't ignore the possibility. When I finally returned home, I tried to lay low, avoiding places where I might run into Adam. Brooklyn suddenly felt smaller, and I found myself sticking to familiar, crowded areas. The thought of crossing paths with him, or with any of those guys from that night, made my skin crawl. A week after I got home, I heard some news that shattered whatever peace I had managed to hold on to. Sarah called me, her voice trembling as she spoke. "Michael, Adam proposed to me, and I said yes." The words hit me like a punch to the gut. I felt everything inside me go numb as I tried to process what she was saying. Adam had proposed to Sarah. He had convinced her to marry him, and she had accepted. "Are you serious?" I asked, struggling to keep my voice steady. There was a pause on the other end of the line. "I know it's a shock, but Adam, he's been there for me, Michael. He told me he wants to leave everything behind, start fresh somewhere else. He said he's changed." I wanted to believe her, to believe that Adam could really change, but after everything that had happened, it was hard to trust that. The memory of his warning at the diner, of the coldness in his eyes, was burned into my mind. "Michael, are you there?" she asked, her voice soft and uncertain. "I'm here," I said quietly. I need some time to think." After we hung up, I sat there, feeling the weight of her words pressing down on me. It was as if the life I had known was crumbling around me, and there was nothing I could do to stop it. Adam, my best friend, had somehow managed to turn Sarah against me, to convince her that he was the one she should be with. For the next few days, I tried to keep my distance, to avoid both Adam and Sarah. But it was impossible to ignore the pain, the feeling of betrayal that gnawed at me day and night. It was like a wound that refused to heal, a reminder of everything I had lost. Then one day, as I was leaving a coffee shop near the hospital where I'd been recovering, I saw Sarah standing outside, looking lost and distracted. She hadn't seen me yet, and I almost turned to leave, but something stopped me. I couldn't just walk away, not without talking to her, without trying to understand what had really happened. "Sarah," I called out, walking toward her. She turned, and for a moment, there was a flicker of surprise in her eyes. Then she smiled, though it didn't reach her eyes. "Michael," she said softly, her voice barely above a whisper. "I didn't expect to see you here." We stood in silence for a moment, both of us unsure of what to say. Finally, she looked down, her hands fidgeting as she spoke. "I didn't know you were hurt," she began. "Adam told me you had moved on, that you didn't want to be a part of our lives anymore. I didn't understand it, but I believed him." Her words stung, but I could see the doubt in her eyes, the flicker of something deeper. She was starting to question him, to see through the lies he had been feeding her. "Sarah," I said, taking a deep breath, "there's something you need to know. I think Adam was behind the attack on me." She looked at me, her eyes widening in shock. "No, that's impossible. He would never." But even as she said it, I could see the uncertainty in her face, the cracks in the image she had of him. She knew him better than anyone, but there were things about Adam that no one could truly understand. "Just be careful," I said quietly, feeling a surge of sadness as I looked at her. "Please, for your own sake." She nodded, her expression torn between disbelief and fear. "I will, Michael. I promise." As she walked away, I felt a strange sense of relief, mixed with an ache that seemed to go down to my bones. I wanted to believe that she would be okay, that she would see through his lies and make her own choice. But deep down, I couldn't shake the feeling that things were only going to get worse. A few days later, I received an unexpected call from an old friend, Tom, who worked at a bar near the edge of town. His voice was tense, almost panicked. "Michael, you need to get down here," he said. "I think I've got something you'll want to see." When I arrived, Tom led me to the back room, where he pulled up security footage from the previous night. There on the screen, I saw Adam, sitting with a group of men, passing around small bags filled with white powder. My stomach twisted as I watched him laugh, looking completely at ease, completely indifferent to the destruction he was spreading. "He's dealing, Michael," Tom said, shaking his head. "I never thought he'd go this far, but he's in deep, way too deep." The sight of Adam, the guy I had once called my best friend, now knee-deep in drug dealing, filled me with a sense of betrayal that I could barely put into words. I realized then that the Adam I had known was gone. He had become someone else, someone who cared about nothing but money and power. Tom and I sat in silence for a moment, the weight of everything settling over us. "You've got to stop him," Tom said finally, his voice barely more than a whisper, "before he destroys himself, or someone else." I nodded, feeling a mix of anger and sadness. I didn't know how to stop him, but I knew that I couldn't just sit by and watch him destroy everything, and everyone, in his path. Over the next few days, I tried to confront Adam, but every time I called or went to his place, he was nowhere to be found. It was like he was avoiding me, like he knew I was on to him. Sarah and I talked a few times, but she was still torn, still holding on to some hope that the Adam she loved was still in there somewhere. Then, one night, as I was walking back to my apartment, I felt a presence behind me. I turned, half expecting to see one of Adam's guys, but instead, it was Sarah. She looked scared, her face pale as she glanced around, making sure no one else was watching. "Michael," she said, her voice trembling, "I need to talk to you. It's about Adam. He's threatened me." Her words hit me like a punch to the gut. I had known that Adam was dangerous, but hearing that he had threatened her made it all too real. "What did he say?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. She looked down, her hands shaking. "He told me that if I left him, if I tried to end things, he would make sure I regretted it. He's not the same person anymore, Michael. I don't know what to do." I felt a surge of anger, a cold, burning rage that I had never felt before. Adam had crossed a line that I could not ignore. "We'll figure it out," I said, taking her hand. "I won't let him hurt you. I promise." In that moment, I knew what I had to do. I had to protect Sarah, no matter what it took. The next day, I went to the police. I told them everything about the drugs, the threats, my suspicions about the attack. The officer taking my statement listened carefully, nodding as he scribbled down notes. I could see the doubt in his eyes, the reluctance to believe that someone like Adam, a local guy from a good family, could be capable of such things. But I insisted, laying out every detail, every reason I had to believe he was dangerous. "Look," I said, my voice tight with frustration. "You don't know him like I do. I know what he's capable of. If you don't do something, more people are going to get hurt, maybe even killed." The officer sighed, setting down his pen. "We'll look into it, Michael. But without solid evidence, our hands are tied." It wasn't the response I had hoped for, but it was a start. At least now, someone in authority knew the truth, or as close to it as I could get them to understand. I left the station feeling both relieved and frustrated, knowing that while I had done all I could, it might not be enough. 2 days later, I got a call. Adam had been arrested. They had raided his apartment and found enough drugs to charge him with possession and intent to distribute. Part of me wanted to feel triumphant, like I had finally won, but all I felt was a hollow ache. Adam wasn't just my friend. He was part of my past, a part of who I was. And now, because of his own choices, he was facing years behind bars. Sarah was relieved, and we spent hours talking about everything, about the life we had known and the way it had all come crashing down. She admitted that she was terrified of what Adam might do if he ever got out. But I reassured her, telling her that with the evidence against him, it was unlikely he would be released anytime soon. For a while, it felt like things were finally starting to settle. I began to think that maybe, just maybe, we could leave it all behind, start fresh, and forget about the nightmares of the past few months. But, as I was quickly learning, nothing with Adam was ever that simple. One evening, a few weeks after Adam's arrest, Sarah started receiving calls from an unknown number. At first, she ignored them, assuming they were just random or a mistake. But when the calls started coming in at odd hours, waking her up in the middle of the night, I knew something wasn't right. One night, after the 5th call, she finally answered. There was silence on the other end, followed by a low, raspy voice. "You think this is over?" The voice sneered. "Think again. You'll pay for what you did to him." The call ended before she could respond, leaving her shaken and terrified. I could see the fear in her eyes, the way her hands trembled as she set down the phone. She looked at me, her voice barely a whisper. "It's not him, Michael," she said, her voice filled with dread. "But it's someone who's working for him." The realization hit me like a punch to the gut. Even from behind bars, Adam was finding ways to reach us, to make sure we knew he hadn't forgotten. I knew then that this was far from over, that he would keep trying to get to us, no matter how far we ran. I went back to the police, showing them the call logs and telling them about the threats. They took it seriously this time, assigning an officer to monitor our apartment and telling us to report anything suspicious. But even with the extra protection, Sarah and I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched, the sense that someone was lurking in the shadows, waiting for the right moment to strike. One night, after another sleepless evening, I decided to take matters into my own hands. I knew that if I wanted to end this once and for all, I would have to confront the real power behind Adam's network, the man known only as the broker. Over the next few days, I began piecing together what I knew about the broker. He was a shadowy figure, someone who operated in the background, connecting people like Adam to the resources they needed to run their operations. He was a ghost, rarely seen, but his influence was everywhere. From what little I had learned, he had connections in almost every part of the city, from the lowliest drug runners to high-powered businessmen. He was the one pulling the strings, the one who could make or break people like Adam. It took time, but eventually, I tracked down a lead. A club on the far side of town, a place known for its exclusivity and its connections to the underground world. If the broker was anywhere, he would be there. When I arrived at the club, I felt a surge of nerves. The place was packed with people, the lights dim and the music loud, creating an atmosphere that was both thrilling and dangerous. I scanned the room, looking for any sign of him, though I had no idea what he looked like or how I would recognize him. All I had was a description from Tom. Tall, with silver hair and a sharp, calculating gaze. After what felt like hours, I finally spotted a man who matched the description. Standing near the back of the club, surrounded by people who looked like they were waiting for his command. He had an air of authority, a presence that was both intimidating and captivating. I took a deep breath, pushing down my fear, and made my way over to him. As I approached, he looked up, his gaze locking onto mine with a cold, assessing stare. For a moment, we just looked at each other, sizing each other up. "You're Michael, aren't you?" he asked, his voice low and smooth. "Adam's friend." "Not anymore," I replied, keeping my tone steady. "I need to talk to you. About him." He raised an eyebrow, a faint smile playing at the corners of his mouth. "And what makes you think I'm interested?" "Because he's out of control," I said, my voice firm. "And if you keep helping him, he'll bring you down with him." The broker chuckled, shaking his head. "You're bold, I'll give you that. But you have no idea what you're dealing with." "Maybe not," I admitted. "But I do know that as long as he's out there, I'll never be free. And neither will Sarah." At the mention of her name, his expression shifted, his gaze sharpening. He studied me for a long moment, as if weighing my words. "Fine," he said finally, his tone cool. "I'll consider your request. But know this, if you cross me, there won't be a second chance." He turned and disappeared into the crowd, leaving me standing there, feeling both relieved and terrified. I had no idea if he would actually keep his word, but it was the only option I had. 2 days later, I received a message. It was short, with just a few words. "It's done. Stay out of my way." I didn't know what he meant, not at first. But then, later that day, I saw the news. Adam had been found dead in his cell, the victim of a prison fight. The story was all over the news, reporters speculating about what had happened, who might have been responsible. But I knew the truth. This was the broker's work. He had made sure that Adam wouldn't be a threat to me or Sarah, or anyone else, ever again. I felt a wave of conflicting emotions. Relief, sadness, guilt. Adam had once been my best friend, the guy I trusted with everything. And now, because of the choices he had made, because of the path he had chosen, he was gone. I told Sarah everything, every detail, every secret I had been holding back. She listened quietly, her face pale, her hands trembling. When I was finished, she looked at me, her eyes filled with a mixture of sadness and relief. "We're free, Michael," she said softly. "We can finally move on." And for the first time, I believed it. For the first time in months, life seemed to settle into something close to normal. Adam was gone, and with him the chaos he had brought into our lives. Sarah and I began to pick up the pieces, focusing on building a life that didn't include the shadows of the past. It felt strange, almost surreal, to wake up without that lingering fear, to walk down the street without constantly looking over our shoulders. Sarah and I decided it was time to leave Brooklyn behind. We had always dreamed of moving somewhere quieter, somewhere we could actually start fresh. So we packed up our things and headed west, eventually settling in a small town where no one knew our names, where we could finally just be ourselves. It was peaceful, quiet, the kind of life I had only dreamed about during those dark months. First, things were tense. Every time the phone rang or we heard an unexpected knock at the door, my heart would race, and I'd find myself bracing for bad news. Sarah was the same, always watching over her shoulder, always nervous in crowded places. But as weeks turned into months, that fear began to fade. We started to build a routine, filling our days with small, simple joys. Cooking meals together, going on long walks, laughing at jokes only the two of us would understand. We found a modest little apartment on the edge of town, close enough to see the mountains in the distance. It was a world away from Brooklyn, from the life we had left behind, and for the first time I felt like we were truly free. One night, as we sat on our tiny porch, watching the stars fill the sky, Sarah looked over at me, a soft smile on her face. "Do you think we're finally safe?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. I nodded, reaching over to take her hand. "Yeah," I replied, squeezing her hand gently. "I think we finally made it. We sat in silence, letting the peace wash over us, each of us lost in our own thoughts. I could see the relief in her eyes, the weight that had lifted from her shoulders. She had been through so much, and seeing her finally able to relax, to truly be at ease, was more than I could have hoped for. But as much as I wanted to believe that it was over, there was still a part of me that couldn't forget everything that had happened. Adam's memory lingered in the back of my mind, a constant reminder of the person I had once called a friend. I knew that what I had done, the choices I had made to protect Sarah and myself, would stay with me forever. One afternoon, about 3 months after we had moved, I received a message from an old friend back in Brooklyn, Tom, the same guy who had warned me about Adam's dealings. His message was short, just a few words, but it sent a chill down my spine. "The broker's been asking about you." My heart sank as I read those words. I had thought that we were free, that we could finally leave that part of our lives behind. But it seemed that the broker had not forgotten about us. I tried to push it out of my mind, to convince myself that it was nothing more than a rumor, that the broker had no reason to come after us. But the fear crept back in, filling my thoughts, making it impossible to feel truly safe. That evening, I told Sarah about the message. I didn't want to worry her, but I couldn't keep it from her, not after everything we had been through. She listened quietly, her expression growing more serious as I explained what Tom had said. "So, he's still out there," she said slowly, a hint of fear in her voice. I nodded, feeling a mixture of anger and frustration. "I don't know what he wants, but I'm not going to let him ruin our lives again. We've come too far for that." For the next few days, we tried to go on as usual, but the anxiety was there, just beneath the surface. Every phone call, every unfamiliar face in town made us feel like we were being watched, like we were still trapped in that world we had tried so hard to escape. Then, one night, after another sleepless evening, I made a decision. I couldn't live like this, constantly looking over my shoulder, waiting for the broker to show up and drag us back into that nightmare. If he was going to come for us, I would meet him on my own terms. I reached out to Tom, asking him for information. He was hesitant at first, warning me that the broker was not someone to mess with, that he was dangerous in ways I couldn't imagine. But I was determined. I couldn't spend the rest of my life running, hiding from a threat that I barely understood. I had to face him to put an end to this once and for all. With Tom's help, I tracked down the broker's latest location, a small, hidden office on the edge of the city. It was a nondescript building, the kind you would walk by without a second thought. But I knew that behind those doors was the man who held the last thread of my past, the one person who could keep us from finding true peace. When I arrived, I felt a surge of nerves, a mixture of fear and determination. I took a deep breath, steeling myself as I walked through the door. The receptionist looked at me, raising an eyebrow, but I ignored her, moving down the hallway toward the office at the end. The broker was sitting behind his desk, his gaze cool and calculating as he looked up at me. He didn't seem surprised to see me. In fact, it almost seemed like he had been expecting me. "Michael," he said, a faint smile playing at the corners of his mouth. "To what do I owe the pleasure?" I took a step forward, meeting his gaze. "I want this to end," I said firmly. "You've done enough damage. Let us go, and I promise you'll never hear from us again." The broker chuckled, leaning back in his chair as he studied me. "You think it's that simple? You think you can just walk away?" "I do," I replied, refusing to back down. "Because if you don't, I'll make sure everyone knows who you really are. I've got connections too, people who would be very interested in taking you down." For a moment, he was silent, his gaze hard and unreadable. Then he nodded, a hint of admiration in his eyes. "You've got guts. I'll give you that," he said slowly. "Fine, I'll give you what you want. But know this, if you break your word, if I ever hear even a whisper about you, there won't be a next time." I nodded, feeling a weight lift from my shoulders. "Understood." He gave a brief nod, his expression cold and unyielding. "Then go, and pray I never have reason to look for you again." I left his office without looking back, feeling a strange mixture of relief and lingering fear. I knew he could change his mind at any moment, that he could decide we were too much of a risk. But for now it was over. When I got home, I told Sarah everything. She listened quietly, her face pale but resolute. "So, we're finally free?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. I nodded, feeling a sense of relief wash over me. "Yeah, I think we really are." For the first time, I believed it. We were free to build a new life, one without the shadows of the past. The following weeks passed in a strange, almost surreal peace. With the broker out of our lives, Sarah and I finally felt like we could breathe. The weight that had been pressing down on us for so long was gone, leaving us free to focus on each other and our new life. We spent our days exploring our small town, getting to know the people, and filling our lives with small routines and quiet moments that felt precious after everything we'd been through. For the first time in months, maybe even years, I felt genuinely happy. It was a simple happiness. Waking up beside Sarah, cooking breakfast together, taking walks down to the river, and watching the sunset from our porch. I realized that I didn't need anything more than this, just the comfort of a life free from fear and filled with love. But even in the peace of our new life, there were nights when the memories would return, uninvited. I'd lie awake, staring at the ceiling, the events of the past few years playing out in my mind like scenes from a film. I thought about Adam, about the friendship we'd shared and the choices he'd made that had ultimately destroyed him. I thought about the promises we'd made as kids, to always have each other's backs, and the terrible irony of how we'd ended up as enemies. One night, as I lay there, lost in thought, Sarah reached over and took my hand. "You're thinking about him again, aren't you?" she asked softly. I nodded, squeezing her hand. "Yeah, I can't help but wonder if there was something I could have done differently. If I'd tried harder, he wouldn't have ended up that way." She looked at me, her gaze gentle but firm. "Michael, you did everything you could. Adam made his own choices. You're not responsible for him, not for the path he chose. You saved us. You saved me." Her words comforted me, and I felt a sense of peace settle over me as I held her hand. She was right. I couldn't change the past, but I could choose to let it go, to focus on the future we were building together. Over the next few months, we began to truly settle into our new life. I found work at a local hardware store, while Sarah started volunteering at a nearby animal shelter. Our days were filled with small, meaningful routines, and I felt a deep sense of gratitude for the life we had created. We were no longer haunted by the shadows of the past, no longer looking over our shoulders. For the first time in a long time, I felt like we had finally made it. Then, one afternoon, as I was closing up at work, I saw a familiar face standing outside the store. It was Tom. He looked older, a little more worn, but there was no mistaking him. He gave me a small nod, and I felt a chill run down my spine. "Tom," I said, stepping outside, my voice filled with both surprise and a hint of worry. "What are you doing here?" He shrugged, glancing around before meeting my gaze. "I was passing through, thought I'd check in on you. See how you're doing." There was something in his tone, a subtle tension that set me on edge. I had known Tom long enough to recognize when he was holding something back. "Is everything okay?" I asked, feeling my heart start to pound. He hesitated, then sighed, running a hand through his hair. "Look, Michael, I don't want to worry you, but I thought you should know. The broker, he's been asking about you." The words hit me like a punch to the gut, and for a moment, I couldn't breathe. I had thought we were done with him, that we had made a deal and that he would keep his word. But hearing Tom's words brought all of that fear rushing back. "What do you mean?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. Tom looked around again, as if making sure no one was listening. "He's been asking questions, trying to find out where you went. I don't know what he wants, but I figured you should know. Just be careful, Michael." I nodded, feeling a knot of anxiety tighten in my stomach. "Thanks, Tom. I appreciate the warning." He clapped me on the shoulder, giving me a reassuring smile. "Take care of yourself, all right? You and Sarah deserve some peace." With that, he walked away, leaving me standing there, the weight of his words pressing down on me. I knew that the broker was dangerous, that he was a man who kept tabs on everything and everyone in his orbit. But I had hoped that our deal would be enough, that he would leave us alone. Now, it seemed like he was still watching, still lurking in the shadows, waiting for some excuse to drag us back into his world. That evening, I told Sarah everything. She listened quietly, her face growing pale as I explained what Tom had said. I could see the fear in her eyes, the same fear I felt in my own heart. "Do you think he'll come after us?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. I took her hand, trying to reassure her, though I wasn't sure I believed my own words. "I don't know. But if he does, we'll face it together." We spent the next few days on edge, jumping at every unexpected sound, every knock at the door. The peace we had built seemed fragile now, like it could shatter at any moment. I hated that we were back to living in fear, that the life we had fought so hard to create was once again threatened by someone else's choices. One night, as we were lying in bed, I realized that I couldn't keep living like this. I couldn't let the broker control our lives from afar, haunting us with the possibility of his return. If I wanted to protect Sarah, if I wanted us to truly be free, I had to face him one last time. The next day, I made a decision. I reached out to Tom, asking him to arrange a meeting with the broker. It was risky, and I knew that I might not come back, but I also knew that it was the only way to end this once and for all. Tom was hesitant, warning me that the broker was not someone to confront lightly, but he agreed to help. We arranged the meeting for a week later, in a neutral location, a rundown warehouse on the outskirts of a nearby city. It was a place the broker used for meetings, a place where he felt secure and in control. I knew I was walking into the lion's den, but I had no other choice. The night before the meeting, Sarah and I sat on our porch, watching the stars fill the sky. She took my hand, her gaze filled with both fear and determination. "Promise me you'll be careful," she said softly. I nodded, squeezing her hand. "I promise. And no matter what happens, I want you to know that I love you. More than anything." She leaned her head on my shoulder, and we sat there in silence, each of us lost in our own thoughts, bracing ourselves for what was to come. The next evening, as planned, I made my way to the old warehouse on the outskirts of the city. The air was thick with tension, and every step I took felt heavier than the last. I knew what I was walking into, a confrontation with a man who held our lives in his hands, someone who could end everything with a single word. But I couldn't let him control us anymore. This was our last chance to escape his grasp. When I arrived, the warehouse was empty and quiet, the only sounds coming from the distant hum of traffic and the occasional creak of old metal. I looked around, scanning the shadows, waiting for the broker to appear. And then, out of the darkness, he stepped forward, his expression calm and unreadable. "Well, Michael," he said, his voice echoing in the vast, empty space. "I have to admit, I didn't expect to see you again. I thought we had an understanding." I took a deep breath, meeting his gaze. "We did, but you didn't hold up your end of the deal. You said you'd leave us alone, but I know you've been asking about us, keeping tabs on where we are. It has to stop." The broker's lips curled into a faint, amused smile. "You think you can just walk away from this? That you can make demands?" He shook his head, a look of mild disappointment on his face. "I told you before, Michael. This world isn't something you can simply leave behind." "I'm done being part of your world," I said firmly. "Sarah and I have moved on. We just want a normal life, one without fear, without looking over our shoulders every day. You've won. Adam is gone. There's nothing left for you to control." He studied me for a long moment, his gaze sharp and calculating, as if weighing his options. I could see the wheels turning in his mind, the subtle flicker of amusement fading into something more serious. "You're asking for a lot, Michael," he said slowly. "People don't get to just walk away from me. But you've proven yourself useful in the past. And I can appreciate a man who's willing to stand up for what he wants." He paused, tilting his head slightly. "What's in it for me?" I hesitated, knowing that this was a dangerous game, that he was testing me. But I held my ground. "You get peace of mind," I said, my voice steady. We'll disappear just like before. No one will ever hear from us again. You won't have to worry about us. Ever. The broker's expression shifted, a glimmer of something almost like respect flickering in his eyes. Fine, he said after a long pause. But let me be clear, if I so much as hear your name again, if I even catch a hint that you've crossed me, there won't be a next time. I nodded, feeling a sense of relief wash over me. Understood. He gave a brief nod, then turned and walked away, disappearing into the shadows as silently as he had appeared. I waited a few minutes, just to be sure, then turned and left the warehouse, feeling as if a tremendous weight had finally lifted from my shoulders. When I returned home, Sarah was waiting for me, her face filled with worry and relief. I wrapped my arms around her, holding her close, feeling the warmth of her embrace chase away the lingering fear. It's over, I whispered. We're finally free. She pulled back slightly, looking up at me with a mixture of hope and disbelief. Are you sure? I nodded, a smile breaking across my face. Yeah, this time, I'm sure. From that moment on, it felt like we were living a new life. The fear that had haunted us for so long was gone, replaced by a quiet sense of peace. We spent the following days planning a real future, one filled with all the things we had been too afraid to dream about. Finding a house, maybe starting a family, building a life that was entirely our own. And slowly, the memories of the past began to fade, like shadows retreating in the light of a new dawn. Years passed, and life became what we had always wanted it to be. We found a small, cozy house on the outskirts of town, surrounded by trees and open fields, a world away from the chaos of the city and the darkness of our old lives. Sarah and I grew into a quiet routine, filling our days with work, laughter, and the simple, ordinary joys of life. One evening, as we sat on our porch, watching the sun dip below the horizon, Sarah leaned her head on my shoulder, her fingers laced through mine. Do you ever think about it? She asked softly, her voice barely more than a whisper. I took a deep breath, letting the cool evening air fill my lungs. Sometimes, I admitted, but it feels like it happened to someone else, like it was just a bad dream. She nodded, her gaze distant. We were lucky, weren't we? Yeah, I replied, squeezing her hand gently. We were. As we sat there, watching the last light of day fade into the night, I felt a deep sense of gratitude, a quiet peace that I had once thought would be impossible. We had been through so much, faced things that I wouldn't wish on anyone, but we had come out the other side stronger, more connected, and finally free. And as the stars began to appear in the sky above, I realized that the shadows of the past no longer held any power over us. We had built a life of our own, one that was filled with love, hope, and a future that was finally ours. In that moment, I knew that no matter what lay ahead, we would face it together, side by side, ready to take on whatever the world had in store. Because, after everything, we had found what we had been searching for all along. A life worth living, and each other.